Has anybody noticed it's Christmas time yet? Oh, I thought maybe you all had not noticed those things. When you go down the road, what do you see? Are your attention drawn to the lights and the things that are around? Matter of fact, in the city of Danville, on Friday evening, there were things all over the places. They had a huge parade down the street, and a lot of folks and a lot of lights and music and other things going. Our sanctuary looks a little different, doesn't it? Those things that are around us. Matter of fact, if you look at yards, you see all the things that are decorating, the trees that are out, and many other things. You walk into houses all over the place. All of those things oftentimes brings the focus of our life to the fact that we're celebrating Christmas. What a terrible thing it is that sometimes, even though the world has tried its best to take the significance of Christmas out of Christmas. They want to take the word Christ out of it. We want to focus upon a winter solace, a celebration, a winter fun time. But I began to think about that. I thought people are focused on everything. They're focused on, the economy. They're focused on how they'll buy gifts. They're focused on wrapping presents. They're focused on preparing meals. They're focused on a lot of things. But yet, in a holiday like that, even though we sometimes condemn those who aren't a people of faith for wanting to take Christ out of Christmas, we've almost successfully done that for them if we're not careful. What are you focused on? Are you focused simply upon how you're going to get the family together and how you're going to celebrate a time like this? Or maybe you're focused upon what Christmas really is, the celebration of the birth of Christ. We must keep our eyes focused on Him. It is absolutely imperative, and that's exactly as we come to this time this morning, not only when we begin kind of the official Christmas season, but when we celebrate as a church together the Lord's Supper. This passage of Scripture that was shared with you by Bob this morning brings the significance of the focus of who they were on that day. It is really easy, folks, to get our focus above the important things of life, isn't it? There are so many things happening around us that distracts all of those things, the hustle and the bustle of the crowds, the things and the multitude of things that we need to accomplish in our whole life. We can get so micro-focused that we can only see a few things and the whole world is going on around us and we just concentrate on that one thing. Oftentimes, even in social life and in social disorders today, we find folks that come so fixed upon things like computers that they won't leave their room, TVs that they simply sit there for hours and hours, or focus upon something that is something simple, and you think, wow, and the phraseology that oftentimes we use is, hey, get a life. There's more than that, isn't there? And yet when we began to realize this, we see the disciples gathered together with Jesus on that day, and they were celebrating something much different than we celebrate today, but yet in one sense they were celebrating something very much the same. They were celebrating the Passover event. They were celebrating when God had delivered the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt, and had told them to take with them as they exited out some hard bread and some fruit of the vine to sustain them in the journey until God was going to sustain them in a different way. And it's always interesting when He told them to have that feast together in the meal. And so from that time, when He brought them out and the death angel passed over and the ones that blood was not applied to the doorpost of their life, the firstborn died. From that time forward, the Jewish people have continued to celebrate that Passover feast. That time when Jesus came into the hearts and lives, or certainly God came into the hearts and lives of the multitude of the nation, and God visited in a very unique and special way. That's exactly what they were doing with Jesus that day when the disciples gathered together. Little did they know of the events that were going to take place following that. For immediately following them celebrating, Jesus was going to be arrested. He was going to be tried. He was going to be crucified. And He was going to rise from the grave after being buried. You say, Dale, that doesn't have a lot to do with Christmas, because Christmas is always about a baby Jesus in a manger, isn't it? No, Christmas is about Jesus altogether. So when I began to think about that, I thought, what is the single thing that we need to focus on most? It is not the material things. It is not the lights. It is not all of those things that are going around. We really need to focus on Jesus, don't we? How do we focus on Him? When I began to think about that, I thought, why do we do that? Well, first of all, I think it's absolutely one of the best ways to show Jesus our love and the love that He deserves. Folks, listen, it is really easy to get detracted. The older I get, the more difficult it is for me to remember the things that I need to do. And sometimes I make lists, but the problem is I forget where I put my list. Y'all don't ever have that problem, do you? You got that sharp mind, you can remember everything, and all of those things, but yet we sometimes forget the important things of life. And when I thought about that in the hustle and bustle of the day we live in today, in the beginning of that season, it's only going to get more difficult. And when I began to think about that, I thought, well, what did these disciples focus on that day when they were celebrating? If they had knew that Jesus was going to die on the cross just a few days later, do you think their focus would have been different than it was that day? I'm not sure. But yet the reality is that if we understood and believed our faith and knew that the encounter with Jesus in our own personal life could be just a few days away, would our focus be different than it is today? We wouldn't be so worried about what we get each other for Christmas or how big the box is. Nobody would be shaking gifts under the tree. Any of you guilty of that? Surely not. As I began to look at this, I began to see the focus of those that were there. They had just celebrated this time with Jesus, the most holy time, but here they were. And we find that Peter later was focused upon his refusal to deny on Jesus, but yet Jesus tells us very quickly that Peter was focused more on his own safety for what he did do when he was challenged about who Jesus was in his life. He denied him just as Jesus had said he would. He wasn't focused on what he could do for Jesus. He was simply focused on self-preservation. Just a little bit later, Matthew tells us that he took that group of men and he took an inner circle of them. He took here Peter and he took the sons of Zebedee and he brought them out and they kept them there outside the Garden of Gethsemane while he went to pray. Now, what were those guys focused on? He told them to wait and to pray for him while he was there praying. But we know the story, and if you don't know the story, what happened is on that evening they fell asleep. Just like us today, they were probably more focused upon their own personal need than they were on the commands of what Jesus had asked them to do. How oftentimes do we know that there's one more thing and we put it off to the end, and somehow we realize and we justify by our tiredness and by our exhaustion and by all the things not to do what Jesus asked us to do. Boy, think about that. They were focused on that. And sometimes we too have lost our focus, haven't we, on Jesus. And what it does is when we lose our focus on Jesus, it draws us away from the mission that we are to accomplish, doesn't it? We talked a lot about missions. We're going to talk a lot about missions the rest of the day. But missions is simply not giving money, but missions is giving life.